He was born into slavery. He had no legal rights, no property, no freedom of movement. His master, by some accounts, broke his leg deliberately, twisting it slowly while Epictetus calmly warned him that it would break. It broke. Epictetus said simply, "Did I not tell you it would break?" He was later freed. He lived the rest of his life in voluntary simplicity. A small hut, a straw mat, an iron lamp. When the lamp was stolen, he replaced it with an earthenware one. He said the thief had done him a favor by teaching him he didn't need the better lamp. Epictetus became one of the most influential philosophers in the ancient world. Emperors read him. Marcus Aurelius carried his ideas into the most powerful position in the Western world, and the core of everything he taught came from the most extreme possible test of a single idea. That what happens to you and who you are not the same thing. That your circumstances do not determine your freedom. That the only prison that can truly hold you is the one you build inside your own mind. Tonight, Epictetus, the slave who became the freest man in the room. Epictetus was born around 50 AD in Hierapolis, a city in what is now Turkey, and spent his early life as a slave in Rome, owned by Epaphroditus, a secretary to the Emperor Nero. He was eventually freed, possibly after Nero's death, and spent the rest of his life teaching philosophy in Rome and later in Nicopolis in Greece, where students came from across the empire to study with him. He wrote nothing himself. Everything we have of his philosophy comes from the notes of his student, Arrian, collected in 2 works, the Discourses and the Enchiridion, which means handbook. The Enchiridion is one of the most direct and practically useful documents in the history of philosophy. It opens with a sentence that contains the entire architecture of everything Epictetus taught. Some things are within our power, others are not. That is it. That is the foundation. Everything else is elaboration. Within our power, our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our aversions, the movements of our own minds, the values we hold, the judgments we make, the response we choose to what happens to us. Not within our power, our bodies, our reputations, our property, our relationships, the opinions other people hold of us, what happens to us in the world, all the external circumstances of a life. Epictetus called this the dichotomy of control, and he argued that almost all human suffering comes from a single error, confusing these 2 categories, treating things that are not within our power as if they were, attaching our well-being to outcomes we cannot control, making our internal state dependent on external circumstances that will always, eventually, disappoint us. The person who needs a particular outcome to be happy has made their happiness contingent on something outside themselves, something that the world can take away, something that other people, chance, time, and circumstance can all interfere with regardless of what the person does or wants or deserves. The person who has located their well-being entirely within what is genuinely theirs, their own responses, their own values, their own choices, has found something that cannot be taken, because it was never outside them to begin with. The broken leg is the purest possible illustration of this principle lived out. A man whose master is deliberately breaking his leg, a situation of absolute powerlessness over external circumstances, responding with calm observation rather than panic or rage. Not because he felt no pain, because he had located himself somewhere that the pain couldn't reach. His body was being damaged. He was not. This is not detachment in the cold, unfeeling sense. Epictetus was not advocating for the suppression of emotion or the pretense that painful things are not painful. He was describing something more precise: the refusal to allow what happens to your body or your circumstances or your reputation to determine what happens to your mind. The maintenance of a space between event and response in which you remain genuinely free. The concept of freedom that Epictetus is working with is radically different from the one most people operate with. The conventional understanding of freedom is external, the absence of constraint, the ability to go where you want, do what you want, say what you want without interference. Freedom as the expansion of available options in the world. This is the freedom that slavery obviously denied Epictetus, the freedom of movement, of choice, of self-determination in the external sense. And yet Epictetus considered himself free. More free, he argued, than many people who possessed every external liberty. Because the freedom he was pointing at was internal, the freedom of a mind that has not made itself dependent on what it cannot control, that cannot be manipulated by the threat of loss, because it has already relinquished attachment to what can be lost, that cannot be destabilized by what happens to it, because it has located its stability somewhere that external events cannot reach. He made the point with characteristic directness. A tyrant, he said, can imprison your body. He can torture it. He can kill it. But he cannot touch your judgment, your faculty of choice, your capacity to respond, unless you hand it to him. The moment you say, "I will be calm only if he leaves me alone," you have handed him the key to your prison. You have made your freedom contingent on his behavior, which means he controls it, not you. The person who maintains their internal composure, regardless of what the tyrant does, who chooses their response rather than having it triggered automatically by what happens to them, has something the tyrant cannot touch, has a kind of freedom that the absence of chains cannot produce, and the presence of chains cannot destroy. This is why Epictetus considered his years of slavery philosophically formative rather than simply traumatic. Not because slavery was acceptable, he never suggested it was, but because the conditions of absolute external powerlessness had forced him to find the thing that external powerlessness could not reach, had stripped away every false version of freedom until only the real one remained. Apply this to the circumstances of an ordinary contemporary life, and the implications are immediate and slightly uncomfortable. How much of your emotional state right now is contingent on things outside your control? How much of your sense of well-being depends on whether a specific person treats you in a specific way, whether your work is recognized, whether the people around you behave as you need them to, whether the circumstances of your life arrange themselves in the configuration you are hoping for. Every one of those dependencies is, in Epictetus's framework, a voluntary surrender of your freedom, not a necessity, a choice, usually an unconscious one, made so habitually that it no longer feels like a choice, but a choice nonetheless, and therefore something that can be chosen differently. The practice Epictetus is pointing toward is not the elimination of preference. You can still prefer that people treat you well. You can still work toward the outcomes you want. What changes is the relationship to the gap between what you prefer and what actually happens. The suffering in that gap is optional, not inevitable, the product of a specific attachment that can, with practice, be loosened. The practical application of Epictetus is more demanding than it sounds when stated abstractly. It is easy to agree in principle that your internal state should not depend on external circumstances. It is considerably harder to actually unhook them, to sit in a situation where someone is treating you badly, or something you worked for has been taken away, or the outcome you needed didn't arrive, and genuinely locate your response in the part of you that is within your control, rather than the part that is reacting automatically to what just happened. Epictetus was honest about this. He did not present the Stoic practice as something that arrived easily or maintained itself without effort. The Enchiridion is full of practical exercises, ways of training the mind to pause between stimulus and response, to examine whether a reaction is coming from judgment or from automatic attachment, to ask in any difficult moment which part of this is actually mine to respond to. One of his most useful observations concerns the things we call our own. My house, my reputation, my relationships, my health. He suggested replacing these possessions with the word borrowed. Not my house, the house I am currently using. Not my health, the health I currently have. Not even my children, in the most difficult version of this practice. The children entrusted to me for a time. This is not coldness. It is clarity. The person who holds everything they love as borrowed rather than owned is not less loving. They may be more loving, because the love is not contaminated by the anxiety of potential loss. They are simply honest about the nature of their relationship to things that are, in fact, outside their ultimate control. Things that can be taken. Things that will eventually change or end regardless of how tightly they are held. The tightness of holding doesn't protect the thing. It only increases the suffering when the thing goes. And things go. They always go. The question is only whether you have made your freedom contingent on their staying. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor we have encountered throughout this series, carried Epictetus with him, a slave's philosophy inside the most powerful palace in the Western world. The irony is not accidental. Marcus understood that the external circumstances of his life, the power, the resources, the freedom of movement that Epictetus never had, did not automatically produce the internal freedom that Epictetus had cultivated under the most extreme constraint. Freedom of circumstance and freedom of mind are not the same thing. They do not reliably produce each other. The emperor and the slave were both working on the same problem from opposite ends of every external spectrum, and arriving, through different routes, at the same understanding. Epictetus lived into his 80s. He taught until the end. He owned almost nothing. By every external measure, his life was one of radical simplicity bordering on poverty. And yet the people who came to study with him, wealthy, powerful, free in every conventional sense, came because he had something they could not find in their own abundance. He had found the thing that cannot be taken, and he spent his life teaching other people where to look for it. The circumstances of your life right now, whatever they are not the measure of your freedom. They never were. They are the conditions inside which the only freedom that cannot be taken is either developed or surrendered. Daily. In the small moments where something happens that you did not choose, and you decide, consciously or not, whether your response belongs to you or to what just happened. Epictetus made that choice under conditions most of us will never face, which is either humbling or clarifying depending on how you look at it. Probably both.